There's a specific sound a perfect sourdough crust makes when it cools, a faint, crackling song that tells you the fermentation was flawless. For 20 years, that sound was the heartbeat of this bakery. But when Tyler, the new 20-something manager, looked at my jars of 80-year-old starter culture, he didn't see heritage. He saw inefficient fungal waste that was hurting his spreadsheets. He thought firing me to switch to instant industrial powder would save the company time. He was wrong. He didn't realize that by ordering me to clear out my personal junk, he was legally handing me the license to walk out with the company's soul. Before I tell you how a single jar of yeast brought $1 million franchise to its knees, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever seen quality sacrificed for a quick buck, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to see how this rises. My name is Marianne, and for the last 22 years, I have served as the head baker for Golden Crust, functioning not just as an employee, but as the biological anchor for the entire operation, a 58-year-old perfectionist who runs her kitchen with the stoic discipline of a chemist and the patience of a saint. My hands are a living topographical map of the choices I have made over these decades. The burn scars on my forearms from reaching into blazing deck ovens form the river valleys, and the thick, protective calluses on my palms are the mountains, built up over 40 years of handling hot steel and living dough. There is a specific, sacred sanctity to a bakery at 3 in the morning, a humid, warm silence broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the massive spiral mixers and the low, electrical hum of the proofing cabinets. It is a world governed strictly by the laws of thermodynamics and biology, a place where you cannot bully yeast into reproducing faster, and where shortcuts always, without exception, reveal themselves in the final bake. This philosophy of patience served us well for a generation, building a loyal following that stretched 3 city blocks every Saturday morning, regardless of the weather. It built the mortgage payment for the original owner and the college funds for my entire staff, but it was a philosophy that held absolutely no value to Tyler, the new operations manager who arrived 3 weeks ago with a fresh MBA, a tailored suit, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what we actually sold. To Tyler, we sold carbohydrates wrapped in brown paper bags, commodities that could be optimized and cheapened. To me, we sold time. He was 29 years old, a man who wore expensive cologne that clashed violently with the warm, yeasty aroma of the fermentation room. He had been hired by the investment group that recently bought a majority stake in the bakery to trim the fat and streamline operations ahead of a planned aggressive franchise expansion. From his very first day, he walked through the kitchen not as a partner, but as a forensic auditor. He didn't look at the golden, blistered crust of the baguettes with pride. He looked at the trash cans to check for wasted flour dust. He didn't smell the caramelized sugars of the morning buns. He smelled the money being spent on high-quality European butter. He carried a tablet like a weapon, constantly tapping away, reducing the sweating, skilled men and women of my team to mere rows on a spreadsheet, variables to be manipulated or deleted. I watched him from my station at the wooden bench, where I was shaping the high-hydration sourdough loaves. I knew his type instantly because I had seen them come and go in the culinary industry for years, men who thought that because they understood the price of wheat, they understood the value of bread. They were always wrong, but they usually caused a significant amount of catastrophic, irreversible damage before they realized it. The conflict began, not with a shout, but with a sneer of disgust. It centered on the fermentation room, a climate-controlled chamber kept at a precise 76 degrees Fahrenheit with 70% humidity. This was the beating heart of the bakery. On the main stainless steel shelf, in 3 large, food-grade glass jars, lived the mother. It was a sourdough starter culture that I had personally carried with me from a small artisan bakery in San Francisco 30 years ago, a culture that traced its biological lineage back another 50 years before that. It was a bubbling, beige slurry of flour and water, teeming with wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria. It was alive, a complex ecosystem that required daily feeding, temperature checks, and stirring. It was the source of the complex, tangy flavor and the chewy, open texture that defined our brand against the competitors. One Tuesday morning, during a routine walkthrough, Tyler stopped in front of the jars. He watched the bubbles rising to the surface and popping, his face twisting into an expression of genuine revulsion. He asked me, in a voice loud enough for the entire prep team to hear, why we were keeping jars of rotting sludge next to the finished product, and why the climate control bill for this specific room was so high. I wiped the sticky dough from my hands and walked over to him, keeping my breathing steady, refusing to let him see my annoyance. I explained, as I would to a child or a new apprentice, that this wasn't sludge. I told him that this culture was the reason our bread didn't taste like the sawdust they sold at the supermarket. I explained the enzymatic breakdown of gluten, the pre-digestion of starches that made our bread easier to digest, and the development of organic acids that functioned as natural preservatives, extending the shelf life without chemicals. I spoke about flavor profiles, about the delicate dance between acetic and lactic acid balance that gave our loaf its signature bite. Tyler didn't hear a word of it. He just stared at the jars, then at his tablet. He noted that the maintenance hours logged for feeding the starter were costing the company nearly $10,000 a year in labor. He pointed out that the 24-hour proofing cycle meant our dough required massive amounts of storage space that could be used for other things. He looked at me with the cold, dead eyes of a man who has never eaten a meal for pleasure and said that he had found a supplier for a chemical dough conditioner and instant yeast blend that would cut our production time by 90%. He called it modernization. I called it suicide. The days that followed were a silent war of attrition, a slow dismantling of everything I had built. Tyler began implementing small changes that chipped away at the soul of the kitchen. He switched our salt supplier to a cheaper, iodine-heavy brand that left a metallic aftertaste on the tongue. He reduced the hydration levels in the recipes because drier dough was faster to machine process, even though it resulted in a tougher, denser loaf that lacked the characteristic open crumb. I fought him on every single point. I refused to sign off on the new ingredient orders, sending them back to purchasing with rejected stamped in red ink. I held emergency meetings with the staff, telling them to hold the line on quality, to ignore the new protocols if they compromised the product. I was protecting the bakery from itself, or rather, from the parasite that had attached itself to management. The tension in the kitchen was palpable. The air was thick with unsaid words and resentful glances. My sous chef, Leo, a brilliant baker who had been with me for a decade, looked terrified. He had a young family and a mortgage, and he couldn't afford to lose his job. But he watched with horror as Tyler systematically dismantled the processes we had perfected over years. The breaking point came when Tyler organized a blind taste test for the executive board to prove his theory that quality didn't matter. He presented 2 loaves, one made with my 80-year-old starter, and one made with his proposed quick-rise chemical blend. He claimed that the board members preferred the new loaf. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but I saw the report later on his desk. It was a farce, a manipulated data set. I knew for a fact that the quick-rise loaf was loaded with sugar to mask the lack of fermentation flavor, a cheap trick that appeals to the unrefined palate on the first bite, but leaves a cloying, empty sensation afterwards. I confronted him in his office the next day. I told him that he was lying to the owners, that he was selling them a short-term gain that would destroy the brand's long-term equity. I told him that you cannot fool the customer forever, that once they realize the soul is gone, they never come back. Tyler didn't shout. He didn't get angry. He just smiled a thin, tight smile and told me that my romantic attachment to bacteria was a liability. He said the decision had already been made. The mother was to be disposed of, and the new protocols were mandatory starting Monday. I stood there, feeling the cold vibration of the industrial air conditioning on my neck, looking at the man who was about to burn down a cathedral to sell the charcoal. I realized then that this wasn't about bread anymore. It was about dominance. It was about a young man needing to prove that his spreadsheet was more powerful than my experience. I told him, clearly and calmly, that I would not destroy the starter, nor would I serve chemical bread to my customers. I told him that, as long as I was head baker, we would bake the right way. Tyler nodded, as if he had expected this exact response. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was already printed, signed, and dated. He slid it across the desk. It was a termination notice for insubordination and failure to adapt to company strategy. He looked at me and said that my services were no longer required, effective immediately. He said security would help me collect my personal items, but I was not to touch any company equipment or recipes. The walk back to the production floor felt like walking underwater. The sounds of the kitchen, the clatter of trays, the hiss of steam injectors, the shouting of orders seemed muffled and distant. I walked to my station, where Leo was scoring baguettes with a lame. He looked up, saw the expression on my face, and stopped mid-motion. I put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed, a silent message to stay calm, to survive the coming storm. Then, I walked to the fermentation room. The security guard, a man named Davis who I had shared coffee with every morning for 5 years, looked at his feet, ashamed to be part of this eviction. I ignored him and went straight to the shelf. I reached for the 3 large jars of the mother. Tyler had followed me out, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching with a triumphant smirk. He made a show of checking his expensive watch. He asked if I was really going to take the garbage with me. He said he was planning to have the night cleaners dump it down the drain, so I was doing him a favor by acting as the trash collector. He mocked me, asking if I was going to keep it as a pet. I turned to him, holding the heavy jars against my chest like they were infants. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't tell him that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. I simply thanked him for clarifying, for the record, that the company had no interest in the starter. I asked him to confirm, verbally, in front of Davis and the staff, that the company considered these jars to be waste material with zero value. Tyler laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the tiles. He announced to the room that the starter was expired product and that I was welcome to it. He waved his hand dismissively. That was all I needed. I placed the jars carefully into my insulated cooler bag, zipping it shut with a finality that felt like a gavel striking a sounding block. I walked to my locker, took my coat, and walked out the back door. I left my apron on the hook. It was the only thing I left behind. Driving home, the silence in my car was absolute. I could feel the presence of the starter in the passenger seat. It sounds foolish to say, but that culture was the oldest living thing I knew. It had survived the Great Depression, wars, and recessions. It had survived because people protected it. Now, it was my turn. When I got home, I didn't collapse. I didn't drink. I went straight to my garage, where I had a dedicated commercial refrigerator for my home baking experiments. I fed the starter. I mixed the flour and water, stirred it into the beige slurry, and watched it breathe. I whispered to it, promising that it would bubble again. Then I went inside, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window. I watched the sun go down, knowing that across town, the night shift at Golden Crust was about to begin the first production run without me and without the mother. I felt a strange, cold pity for them. They were about to learn that you can fire a baker, but you cannot fire physics. The collapse began with a whisper, then a rumble, then a landslide. For the first 2 days, I heard nothing but the birds in my garden. I spent the time pruning my roses, forcing myself to not check my email, to not drive past the bakery. But the digital world is permeable. On Wednesday morning, my phone began to buzz with text messages from Leo. They were short, panicked bursts of information. Dough isn't rising, oven spring is dead, crumb is gummy, Tyler is screaming at the mixer. I didn't reply. I couldn't. If I engaged, I would be dragged back in. I had to let the failure happen. It had to be absolute. By Thursday, the public outcry began. I sat at my kitchen table and scrolled through the Golden Crust Yelp page. It was a bloodbath. I don't know what happened, but the bread today was inedible, wrote one user, posting a photo of a loaf that looked like a pale, dense brick. Used to be the best in the city, now it tastes like supermarket trash, wrote another. The photos were the most damning evidence. Sourdough relies on the wild yeast to create gas pockets, giving the bread that beautiful, airy interior structure known as the crumb. The photos showed bread that was dense, tight, and heavy. It looked like modeling clay. Without the acidity of the starter, The gluten hadn't broken down properly, resulting in a rubbery texture that was impossible to chew. And the color, it was all wrong. Without the caramelization of the natural sugars, the crust was a sickly, matte beige instead of a rich, shiny mahogany. Tyler's quick-rise yeast had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had puffed up the dough quickly, but it hadn't developed any structure or flavor. It was a hollow imitation of bread, and the machinery knew it too. Leo texted me that the dough dividers were jamming because the viscosity was wrong, and the expensive German ovens were burning the bottoms of the loaves while the centers remained raw. On Friday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting guests. When I opened the door, I found two uniformed police officers standing on my porch. Behind them, pacing back and forth on my driveway like a caged animal, was Tyler. He looked terrible. His suit was rumpled, his hair was disheveled, and he had dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me, he pointed a shaking finger and shouted to the officers, "That's her! She's the one who stole the formula!" The neighbors were starting to look out their windows. I stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind me to keep the cool air inside. I asked the officers how I could help them. One of them, a polite sergeant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, explained that Golden Crust Management was pressing charges for theft of proprietary intellectual property and corporate assets, specifically the master fermentation agent. I looked at Tyler. He was desperate. He had realized, likely after 48 hours of throwing away batch after batch of inedible dough, that the magic wasn't in the machines. He thought he could bully the police into retrieving the starter for him. He thought he could confiscate my property like he had confiscated my access card. I invited the officers to wait for a moment and went to my home office. I retrieved a leather-bound folder containing my original employment contract from 22 years ago. I walked back out and handed it to the sergeant, open to the final addendum. "Officer, please read Clause 14B, I said, my voice cutting through Tyler's sputtering protests. The officer read it aloud. The biological leavening agent, known as the mother starter, is acknowledged to be the sole personal property of Marianne Vance, brought by her to the establishment. Its use is granted to the company on a loan basis only, contingent upon her continued employment and direct supervision of the fermentation process. Upon severance of employment, the loan is immediately revoked and the agent must be returned to the owner." I looked at Tyler. "You didn't just fire me, Tyler. You fired the yeast. You stood there and called it garbage. You told me to take it away. Now that you realize you can't bake a single decent loaf without it, you want to call it theft?" The sergeant handed the contract back to me and turned to Tyler. His expression was a mixture of annoyance and amusement. He told Tyler that this was clearly a civil contract dispute, not a criminal matter, and that based on the document he just read, no theft had occurred. He advised Tyler to contact a lawyer and to stop using the police department as his personal courier service, warning him about filing false reports. As the police car pulled away, Tyler stood alone on my driveway. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The arrogant executive was gone, replaced by a frightened boy who had broken something expensive and didn't know how to fix it. He swallowed hard and took a step toward the porch. "Marianne," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "Look, maybe we can work something out. The production line is stalled. We're losing thousands a day. Can you just give us a cup of it? Just enough to get a culture going?" I looked at him, and I thought about the 20 years of early mornings. I thought about the holidays I missed because the dough needed me. I thought about the disrespect he had shown to my craft, to my team, and to the biology itself. "It takes a month to stabilize a new culture from a sample, Tyler," I said. "And even if I gave it to you, you'd kill it in a week. You don't know how to feed it. You don't know how to listen to it. You think it's just an ingredient. It's not. It's a relationship, and we don't have one anymore." I went back inside and locked the door. I watched him through the peephole as he kicked the tire of his luxury sedan, got in, and drove away. The following week was a masterclass in corporate collapse. The desperation phase had begun. I didn't need to be inside the building to know what was happening. The city is small, and news travels fast in the food industry. I heard from a friend who managed the receiving dock at the Meridian Hotel, our biggest wholesale client, that the executive chef had thrown a tray of Golden Crust rolls across the kitchen after tasting them. They were hard, flavorless, and stale within an hour of delivery. On Tuesday, the hotel formally canceled the contract. That was a $500,000 blow. Then the boutique cafes started dropping us. They couldn't serve that bread to their customers without damaging their own reputations. Golden Crust was becoming toxic. My phone rang incessantly. First, it was the HR director, a woman who had sat silently while Tyler fired me, now leaving voicemails about exit interview discrepancies and potential freelance opportunities. Then it was the legal department, threatening injunctions that they knew they couldn't win, just trying to scare me. I blocked them all. I focused on my garden. I baked small, perfect batches of sourdough for the local homeless shelter. The volunteers told me it was the best bread they had ever eaten. It was a quiet, private victory. I was proving that the quality lived in my hands, not in their building. Finally, the call came from the top. Mr. Sterling, the majority owner. He was a man who cared only about the bottom line. But unlike Tyler, he wasn't delusional. He knew when he was beaten. He called me on a Thursday evening. He didn't bluster. He didn't threaten. He sounded exhausted. "Marianne," he said, "we're bleeding out. The ovens are cold. The staff is threatening to walk out. Tyler has been removed from the building." "Removed is not fired, Mr. Sterling," I said, leaning against my kitchen counter. "He's on administrative leave," Sterling replied. "Then we have nothing to talk about." I moved to hang up. "Wait!" he shouted. Okay, he's gone. I'll fire him. Just, can we talk? Can I come to see you?" He arrived an hour later. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He sat at my kitchen table, and I placed a loaf of bread in front of him. It was a rustic country loaf, dark and craggy, smelling of caramelized wheat and deep fermentation. He stared at it like it was a holy relic. He tore off a piece and ate it. I saw his shoulders drop. He closed his eyes. It was the taste of his profits, yes, but it was also the taste of a promise kept. "I need you back," he said. "Name your salary. Double? Triple? I don't care. Just bring the jars back." "I won't be an employee, Mr. Sterling," I said. "I'm done with performance reviews and managers who think they know better. I'm done with being a line item on a budget." I slid a contract across the table. I had drafted it with my own lawyer days ago. "This is a consulting and licensing agreement. You don't hire me. You hire my company. I will lease you the starter culture for a monthly fee. I will oversee the quality control as an external auditor. I come in twice a week. I have absolute veto power over ingredients and processes. And if I see Tyler, or anyone like him, anywhere near the production floor, the license is revoked and the jars leave with me again. Permanently." He read the terms. The monthly fee was astronomical, more than my old annual salary. The control clauses were draconian. But he had no choice. His factory was silent. His trucks were empty. His brand was dying. He looked at me, and for the first time, he saw me not as a baker, but as a business partner who held all the leverage. "Where do I sign?" he asked. The next morning, I drove to the bakery. I didn't park in the employee lot. I parked in the visitor spot right in front. I walked in through the front door. The smell of the place was wrong. It smelled of bleach and panic. But as I walked into the kitchen, carrying the cooler bag, the atmosphere shifted. Leo saw me first. He didn't say a word. He just dropped the broom he was holding and straightened up. The other bakers stopped what they were doing. I walked to the fermentation shelf, which had been empty for weeks. I unzipped the bag and lifted out the jars. The glass clinked against the metal shelf. I opened the lid. The sharp, tangy, beautiful smell of the mother wafted out, cutting through the sterile air. It was the smell of life. I turned to Leo. "Get the organic flour," I said. "We have a lot of work to do." Leo smiled, tears in his eyes. "Yes, chef." The machines started up. The hum returned. But it was different now. It wasn't just a bakery anymore. It was a kingdom. And the queen had returned to her throne. The ink on the consulting contract was barely dry when the physical reclamation of the bakery began, a process that felt less like a cleaning and more like an exorcism of a hostile spirit. My first official act as the external consultant was to stand in the center of the silent production floor, surrounded by the stagnant air of a factory that had lost its soul, and point a finger at the pallets of industrial ingredients Tyler had ordered. I didn't need to shout to make my authority felt. The silence of the room amplified my command. I instructed Leo and the prep team to bring the heavy-duty hand trucks. We were not going to sell the remaining drums of quick-rise chemical yeast to a competitor, nor were we going to donate them, because I would not inflict that soulless product on any human being. We carted them out to the industrial dumpsters behind the building, bag after 50-pound bag of white, lifeless powder thudding heavily into the metal bin. With every bag that left the kitchen, the atmosphere seemed to physically lighten, the sharp metallic tang of artificial additives slowly being replaced by the neutral, clean scent of stainless steel and stone waiting to be warmed. Once the floor was purged of the chemical contaminants, we turned our attention to the machinery itself, treating the equipment like a patient recovering from a toxic ingestion. The massive spiral mixers had to be scraped down and sanitized by hand, stripped of the gummy, glue-like residue left behind by the high-sugar commercial dough formulas Tyler had forced the team to use. The wicker bannetons, the proofing baskets that gave our bread its signature spiral flower pattern, had been stained by the artificial coloring agents used to make the industrial bread look wheat-like, and we spent 4 grueling hours scrubbing them with stiff brushes. It was a labor-intensive penance, a necessary ritual to reset the standard. I saw the staff watching me, scratching at the dried dough with my own fingernails, and I saw the realization dawn in their eyes that the hierarchy had shifted back to meritocracy. We weren't just going back to work, we were reclaiming the integrity of our craft, inch by square inch. When the last surface was wiped down and the floors were mopped with hot water and vinegar, the kitchen was silent, sterile, and waiting. A blank canvas ready for the return of the master. I walked to the fermentation shelf, the same metal rack that had stood empty and cold for the weeks of my exile. The glass jars in my cooler bag felt warm to the touch, the culture inside responding to the ambient heat of the kitchen as if it knew it was home. I unscrewed the lid of the primary jar, and the sound of the escaping gas was a soft, distinctive hiss, a sigh of relief from a living organism that had been held in captivity. I brought the jar to my nose and inhaled deeply, closing my eyes to dissect the aroma. It was complex and aggressive, a sharp, assertive punch of acetic acid followed by the mellow, creamy notes of lactic acid and the deep, earthy undertone of fermented wheat berries. It was the smell of history, of resilience. I called Leo over and held the jar out to him without saying a word. He took a breath, and I watched his shoulders drop 3 inches, the tension of the last month evaporating in a single inhale. He looked at me, his eyes shiny under the harsh fluorescent lights, and whispered that it smelled like the truth. I told him to weigh out the organic rye flour and the filtered water. It was time to feed the beast and wake the bakery from its coma. The revival of the production line was not an instant event, but a slow, deliberate biological negotiation. Sourdough does not operate on a switch. It operates on a logarithmic curve of bacterial activity. We had to wake the culture up, feed it, and wait for it to reach peak fermentation activity before we could even think about mixing our first batch of dough for sale. For the next 24 hours, the kitchen operated in a state of quiet, focused tension that felt almost surgical. Mr. Sterling, the owner who had been brought to his knees by his own greed, stood in the doorway of the glass-walled office, watching us with a mixture of anxiety and awe. He didn't speak. He didn't check his watch. He simply witnessed the process he had previously tried to eliminate as inefficient. He watched as we measured the water temperature to the 10th of a degree. He watched as we mixed the flour and water for the autolyse stage, letting the mixture rest for 60 minutes so the gluten bonds could begin to form naturally without mechanical stress. He watched the physical effort required to fold the dough by hand, turning the heavy, wet mass over on itself to trap the carbon dioxide bubbles that would eventually become the open, airy crumb of the finished loaf. When the mixers finally began to turn with the real dough inside, the acoustic signature of the room changed completely. The chemical dough had slapped against the sides of the metal bowls with a wet, sloppy noise, like mud hitting a wall. The natural dough, strengthened by time and proper enzymatic development, made a rhythmic, thumping sound. a deep heartbeat that resonated through the floorboards and into the soles of our shoes. I stood by the primary mixer, listening, adjusting the speed, not by looking at a digital timer, but by the pitch of the motor and the sound of the dough hook engaging with the gluten network. This was the sensory data that Tyler had never understood, the inputs that cannot be captured in a spreadsheet or a quarterly report. I pulled a piece of the raw dough and stretched it between my flour-dusted fingers, performing the window pane test. It stretched thin and translucent without tearing. A perfect organic web ready to hold the gases of fermentation. I nodded to Leo, and for the first time in weeks, the kitchen felt alive. The dough was ready. The proofing stage was the longest and most excruciating wait. We filled the bannetons and placed them in the retarder for the cold ferment, a process that Tyler had hated because it required the inventory to sit idle for 18 hours. But as I walked through the rows of resting loaves, checking the skin tension and the rise, I felt a profound sense of vindication settling in my chest, heavier and warmer than the heat radiating from the hearth. We were banking time. We were investing patience. And I knew, with the absolute certainty of a master, that the return on this investment would be immediate and undeniable. I went home that night, leaving Leo in charge of the loading schedule, my phone turned on loud, waiting for the news. I didn't sleep much, staring at the ceiling. But for the first time in weeks, the insomnia wasn't born of anxiety or rage. It was the electric hum of anticipation. I returned to the bakery at 4 a.m, the hour of the wolf, just as the first batch was scheduled to be pulled from the deck ovens. The air outside on the street was cool and still, damp with the morning fog. But as I opened the front door, I was hit by a physical wall of warmth and aroma that nearly brought me to my knees. It was a smell so rich, enveloping, and primal that it felt solid enough to lean against the scent of caramelized crust, toasted wheat germ, and the distinct, vinegary tang of the sourdough culture engaging with the heat. It was the smell that had built this business from a storefront to an institution. I walked into the kitchen just as Leo was pulling the long wooden peel from the oven mouth. He slid the loaves onto the cooling rack, and the sound filled the room. The song of the bread. It was a crackling, popping chorus of cooling crusts contracting as the steam escaped, a delicate symphony that only exists when a loaf has been baked perfectly on hot stone. I looked at the loaves. They were dark, chestnut-colored, blistered with tiny bubbles, and slashed with ears that had curled back perfectly. They were beautiful. We didn't need to send out a press release or buy ad space to announce that Golden Crust was back. The ventilation fans did the marketing for us. By 6 a.m, the smell had drifted down the block, waking up the neighborhood and triggering the lizard brains of everyone within a half-mile radius. By 7, the line had formed, wrapping around the corner just like in the old days. I stood near the front counter, hidden behind a tall rack of cooling bowls, and watched the customers. I saw the regulars, the people who had written those scathing one-star reviews just a week ago, walking in with hesitant, skeptical expressions. I saw them pick up the samples we had put out. I saw the moment the bread hit their tongues, the resistance of the crust, the chew of the crumb, the burst of complex acidity. I saw the skepticism dissolve into pure delight. They bought everything. By 10 a.m, the shelves were bare. We had sold out every single loaf, baguette, and croissant. The cash register didn't stop ringing for 3 hours straight. A chaotic melody of commerce that sounded like an apology. Mr. Sterling came down from his office around noon, stepping carefully through the flour dust. He looked at the empty shelves, then at the sales report on the computer screen. The numbers were back to pre-crisis levels in a single morning, driven by a frantic demand from customers, terrified that the bread would disappear again. He looked at me, standing there with my arms crossed, and he didn't say a word about efficiency, labor costs, or modernization. He simply nodded, a gesture of total surrender and newfound respect. Later that afternoon, my phone pinged with a notification from my bank. The first payment of my consulting fee had cleared. It was a substantial sum, enough to cover my expenses for months, but the satisfaction I felt wasn't financial. It was the validation that the world still valued mastery, that you couldn't replace a lifetime of experience with a bag of chemical powder and a graph. I had won. not by fighting Tyler on his terms, but by forcing the entire company to exist on mine. The transition from employee to consultant changed the fundamental texture of my existence. Over the next 6 months, the bakery became my client, not my cage. I no longer had to endure the daily grind of the early shifts unless I chose to, freeing my body from the punishment it had endured for decades. I came in twice a week to inspect the mother, to taste the production batches, and to mentor the staff. The power dynamic with the team shifted beautifully. I was no longer the strict boss who managed their schedules and approved their time off, but the master teacher who helped them refine their craft. Leo flourished under this new arrangement, stepping into the role of head baker with a confidence he had never shown before. He knew that I was there as a safety net, a guardian of the standard, which allowed him to take ownership of the kitchen in a way he never could when I was there casting a shadow every day. As for Tyler, his exit from the industry was as rapid as his ascent had been unearned. The culinary world in a city of this size is incredibly small. A closed ecosystem where word travels faster than a kitchen fire. The story of the Golden Crust collapse and the arrogant MBA who tried to fight biology and lost became a cautionary tale told in professional kitchens across town. He tried to land a position at a logistics firm, and then at a corporate restaurant group, but the reputation of being the man who nearly destroyed a beloved heritage brand for the sake of a spreadsheet followed him like a bad smell. I heard through the grapevine that he eventually moved back to the Midwest, taking a mid-level job in a completely different industry, far away from anything that required yeast, patience, or the respect of skilled laborers. He had learned the hard way that you cannot optimize a soul, and in trying to do so, he had optimized himself right out of a career. Mr. Sterling, to his credit, honored every syllable of our draconian contract. The near-death experience of his investment had terrified him into a permanent state of compliance. He stopped trying to suggest cheaper ingredients. He stopped asking why the fermentation took so long. He simply signed the checks and stayed in his office, letting the bakers bake. We developed a cold, professional rapport. He knew that I held the keys to the kingdom, the revocable license to the starter, and that if he ever tried to cross me again, I wouldn't just leave. I would legally strip the bakery of its identity overnight. It was a peace maintained by the threat of mutually assured destruction, and it worked perfectly for everyone involved. With the financial freedom my consulting fees provided, I began to look outward, past the daily production cycle. I had spent 40 years feeding people's bodies, but I realized I had a desire to feed something else. I converted the garage where I had kept the starter during my exile into a small, professional-grade teaching kitchen. I didn't open it to the public for expensive sourdough workshops, though I could have charged a fortune for them given my newfound notoriety. Instead, I reached out to a local organization that supported young adults with autism and sensory processing differences. I had always believed that baking was a sensory language, a way of communicating that didn't require words or eye contact. It was tactile, rhythmic, and predictable in its chemistry, yet magical in its result. I started a program called The Quiet Kitchen. Twice a week, I hosted a small group of students. We didn't focus on speed, efficiency, or profit margins. We focused on the feel of the flour, the temperature of the water, the smell of the yeast. I watched young men and women who struggled to navigate the chaotic noise of the outside world come alive when they touched the dough. I saw the anxiety leave their bodies as they fell into the rhythmic, meditative motion of kneading. One student, a young man named David, who was nonverbal, turned out to have an almost supernatural instinct for shaping baguettes. He could feel the tension in the gluten network better than bakers I had hired with 10 years of experience. When he pulled his first perfect loaf from the oven, the look of pride on his face was worth more than every consulting check Mr. Sterling had ever written me. One afternoon, a year after the collapse, I was standing in my garden, wiping flour from my hands after a class. My phone rang. It was Leo. He was calling to tell me that Golden Crust had just been voted best bakery in the city by the local magazine, reclaiming the title we had lost during the dark times of the chemical dough. He wanted to know if I wanted to come down for the photo op with the mayor. I thanked him, but I declined. I told him that the victory belonged to him and the team who were there every day, sweating in the heat of the ovens. I hung up and looked back at my garage, where David was carefully cleaning the workbench, treating the wood with the same respect I had shown the mother. I realized then that my legacy wasn't the bakery. The bakery was just a building, a business that would eventually be sold or changed or closed. My legacy was the starter bubbling in the jar, the culture that would outlive me, and the knowledge I was passing on to Leo, to David, to anyone who was willing to slow down and listen to the bread. Tyler had tried to erase me by firing me, but he had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of my life. He had forced me to realize that my value wasn't tied to a job title or a paycheck. My value was in what I carried in my hands and in my head, assets that could never be confiscated or downsized. I went back into my small kitchen and opened the fridge. The jar of Mother's starter, the backup of the backup, sat on the shelf. It was bubbling gently, alive and hungry, indifferent to the dramas of the corporate world. I took it out, set it on the counter, and began to feed it. Flour, water, time. The recipe never changes. The world spins forward, full of noise and haste, and people like Tyler who want to hack the system. But the yeast doesn't care. It just eats, and grows, and waits. And as long as there are hands willing to tend to it, the bread will always rise. The collapse of the bakery had been a painful, terrifying chapter. But looking back, it was necessary. It was the fire that burned away the dead wood, allowing something new and stronger to grow in its place. I had taken their supply chain, yes. I had brought their business to its knees, but in doing so, I had saved the one thing that actually mattered. I had saved the integrity of the craft. And sitting there in the quiet of my own home, listening to the faint, crackling song of a cooling loaf on the counter, I knew that it was the sweetest revenge I could have ever asked for.